I remember the sound of the bell, that sharp, lonely clang that split the thunder like a knife. No one was supposed to ring it after dark. No one ever had. Not in all the years I lived behind those walls. But that night, it rang once, clean and deliberate, and I knew something was wrong. The rain was coming down so hard it made the stone floors slick beneath my bare feet. I didn't have time to dress. I didn't even stop to grab my shoes. I clutched my rosary so tight it left welts in my palm, and I ran. Past the cold dormitories, past the statue of Saint Veronica, whose eyes seemed to follow me, past the chapel door that had never, in my memory, been left open. Something was wrong. And it wasn't just the storm. I didn't know where the others were. I only knew we had made a promise. If anything happened, we would leave. We would run, no matter what. We had planned it for weeks, waiting for the right night. A night just like this. But I was the only one at the gate. My name is Sister Grace. I was a nun at St. Verena's Convent for nearly 6 years. I entered when I was 17, full of devotion and quiet hope. I believed the convent would bring me closer to God. What I found there was something else entirely. And tonight, after nearly 3 decades of silence, I am going to tell you the truth. I didn't leave St. Verena because I lost my faith. I left because I saw what happens when the church uses faith as a shield for evil. I left because I survived, and because the others didn't. I first laid eyes on St. Verena's in the spring of 1961. The air was cool and clean, the kind of crisp that clings to your skin like memory. My father had driven me in silence for over 2 hours, past empty fields and shuttered barns, saying nothing until we reached the iron gate. He turned off the engine, looked ahead at the stone building in the distance, and told me to remember why I came. I nodded, but the truth was I wasn't quite sure. I was 17, small for my age, and unsure of everything except the need to be good. I had always been obedient, always quiet. My mother said I had the kind of soul that belonged to God. She believed I was born to serve Him, to do something pure with my life. When the sisters from the parish visited and spoke about St. Verena's as a place of peace and devotion, I didn't question it. It sounded like safety. It sounded like purpose. The convent stood on a rise above a dying village no one talked about. St. Verena's itself was a relic. 3 stories of gray stone veined with ivy, windows narrow and tall, and a bell tower that cast a long shadow across the field. The air smelled of something old and sweet, lavender maybe, mixed with candle wax and rain. It didn't feel haunted then, just quiet. It felt like a place that swallowed sound and held it tightly. Mother Eugenia met me at the gate. She was tall, with a posture so straight it looked painful, and eyes the color of old ash. Her hands were folded neatly over her belt, and when she greeted me, her voice was both kind and cold. She welcomed me with a nod and a single sentence. "You'll find peace here, child, but only if you earn it." I remember the way she looked at me, like she was measuring something invisible. Inside, the convent was dim and clean. The walls were lined with framed portraits of saints and past mothers superior, all of them pale and stern. The floors were bare stone. No rugs, no paintings. Just order. I was shown to a narrow room with a single bed, a small wooden cross on the wall, and a basin for washing. My suitcase was placed on the floor beside the bed. A young novice brought me my robes and said nothing. I changed, folded my old clothes, and sat on the edge of the mattress until I was summoned for prayers. Life at St. Verena's was strict, but not unkind in the beginning. We rose before dawn, prayed in silence, worked in the gardens or kitchen. There were no mirrors, no music, no outside newspapers. Letters to family were allowed, but only once a month, and always reviewed before sending. We were told it was to protect our focus, to quiet the world inside. I accepted the rules. I believed they were part of becoming holy. But even then, something didn't sit right. The way silence seemed to press against the walls like a presence of its own. The way the chapel floor always felt slightly damp, no matter the season. The way older sisters never spoke to us after dark. I told myself it was all part of the mystery of devotion, that God lived in the quiet. But deep down, I already knew something else lived there too. Something watching. Something waiting. By the start of my 3rd year, the rhythm of convent life had become second nature. I moved like the others did, quietly and without hesitation, rising before the sun, folding linen with precision, praying without question. But beneath that still surface, something restless had begun to stir. It wasn't disobedience, it wasn't doubt, it was something quieter, something more dangerous. It was awareness. The signs were small at first, scratches beneath the chapel pews that didn't match the grain of the wood, Latin phrases carved into the underside of benches, words we hadn't been taught. I only found them when I dropped my rosary one morning after lauds and reached under to retrieve it. My fingers brushed a rough etching. When I leaned in, I saw the phrase clearly, though it made no sense to me at the time. Ad tenebras vocatus sum. I was called to the darkness. I didn't mention it. We weren't encouraged to speak idly, and questions were rarely met with answers. But a few days later, I caught Sister Alina glancing at the same bench. She didn't touch it. She only looked, then looked at me. That was the first time we understood we shared something unspoken. Sister Alina was older than me by a few years, with dark hair always pulled too tightly and eyes that missed nothing. She never gossiped, never laughed at mealtime, never lingered. But there was something about her stillness that felt intentional. We began sitting near each other at evening prayer, and eventually, in the privacy of the herb garden, she spoke. "You've seen them too," she said, pulling dead leaves from the basil. I didn't ask what she meant. I only nodded. She went on softly. "The carvings, the closed-off corridors, the sounds from under the chapel floor, they're not accidents." She told me that there were places in the convent no one was supposed to go, that the west wing had once been open, but now stood sealed behind iron hinges, that the cellar wasn't for storage. She said the older nuns flinched when it was mentioned, and that none of the novices ever lasted more than 3 years. That night, I began to listen differently. The convent had always been quiet, but now I noticed the wrong kind of silence. A silence that wasn't peace, but pressure. It wrapped around you at night, thick and watchful. I began waking in the dark with the sense that someone had just stepped away. My lamp would flicker without cause. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors. Then came the chanting. It started just after midnight prayers, faint and rhythmic, coming from below the chapel floor. The sound was muffled, like voices layered behind stone, never clear enough to understand but always steady, like a litany from another time. I confronted Alina again. She crossed herself and said only, "There is a place beneath us. We are not meant to ask about it." I pressed, but she grew quiet. The next day, she avoided me entirely. Whatever was happening here, it had rules of its own, and even the ones who knew better were afraid to speak. Sister Irene vanished in the 2nd week of November. She had been sick for days, pale and trembling, eyes wide with some kind of fevered fear. She muttered to herself at night, something about voices and shadows in the chapel. The older nuns kept her isolated, saying she needed rest. Then, one morning, her bed was empty. Her things were gone. And no one spoke of her again. We were told she had been taken to a hospital in a nearby town. That was the official line. But I knew that wasn't true. The hospital was hours away. We never heard a carriage come. Never saw anyone arrive. Her disappearance was clean. Too clean. And when Alina found blood-streaked linens in the laundry 2 days later, hidden at the bottom of a basket meant for fasting cloths, we knew something had happened. Alina came to me that night, shaking. "There's something below," she whispered. "It's not just whispers or stories. There's a place beneath us that isn't meant for light." We waited until the first Sunday of Advent. Mother Eugenia had left for a clergy summit, something she did once a year. It was the only time the convent felt less tightly wound. The other sisters stayed busy preparing for the feast days, and the novices were kept to the dormitories. It gave us a few hours, just enough. We searched her quarters first. Alina knew the layout, having cleaned the room before. There was a chest of drawers with one that didn't slide out all the way. Behind it, we found a small compartment lined with dried lavender and wrapped linen. Inside, there was an old key, long and rusted, with a carved V on its stem. The key fit the iron door behind the chapel's main altar. It had always been locked. Covered with a red velvet cloth, dismissed as a storage room no one needed to enter. We waited until the afternoon light faded and slipped through while the others prepared for vespers. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a stone stairwell spiraling into darkness. The air that met us was cold, damp, and full of weight. We lit our candles and descended, one step at a time, our breaths loud in the stillness. The cellar was not a storage room. It was a corridor of narrow cells, iron-barred doors along each wall. Inside, some were old restraints, leather cuffs still bolted to the stone, rusted chains, remnants of what looked like torn robes or habits. In one cell, a small wooden table with a Bible split down the spine sat beneath a cracked crucifix. At the far end of the hall, we found a wall lined with names, dozens of them, each carved carefully into the stone, each followed by a date. None went past 1959. All were marked with a deep line cutting through the letters. We stood there, silent, our candles flickering. It was clear now. These weren't storage rooms. They were graves of a different kind, and someone had been keeping track. If there was anyone among us who could have exposed the truth on her own, it was Sister Judith. She had a fire in her that nothing could smother. Where the rest of us bowed our heads, Judith met every gaze directly. Where we whispered our fears in gardens or corners, she spoke them aloud. It made her dangerous, but it also made her necessary. Judith had joined St. Verena's 2 years after me. She was older, in her late 20s, and carried the kind of defiance that didn't fade with prayer. Some of the sisters saw her as prideful. Others were drawn to her strength. I admired her because she never pretended. She believed in God, deeply, but she believed just as fiercely in truth. And something about the convent never sat right with her. After Irene disappeared, Judith was the only one who demanded answers. She asked about the missing letters, about the sisters no one ever mentioned again. When silence followed, she asked louder. Mother Eugenia met her questions with the same cold poise she used for all disobedience. She told Judith to spend more time in isolation, to reflect, to fast. Judith didn't fast. She wrote instead. Late into the night, by candlelight, scratching out letters we were never allowed to send. She kept them beneath her mattress, folded in pages of scripture. We weren't supposed to read one another's writing, but Alina and I did. We read every word carefully and in secret. She described what she had overheard in the sanctuary one night. Strange chanting. The sound of something dragged across stone. A voice, low and male, speaking Latin that even she couldn't fully understand. She believed they were performing some kind of ritual. Not a service, not a prayer. Something else. Then, without warning, Judith was gone. We were told she had been transferred to a convent in the mountains, that she had volunteered for a life of deeper isolation. No goodbyes, no letters, no word from her again. But the day after she disappeared, I passed her cell and found her mattress stripped, her trunk emptied, her crucifix missing from the wall. I also found a small piece of paper wedged beneath a loose floor tile. Just one line, hastily scrawled in her hand. "They won't let us go." That night, the chapel bell rang once after Compline. No one acknowledged it. No one moved. But Alina and I looked at each other across the prayer hall and understood. Judith hadn't left. She had been silenced. From that day on, fear took a firmer hold of the ones who remained. The silence became heavier. The glances between us sharper, more cautious. We understood now that whatever we were caught in was not about faith or devotion. It was about control. And Judith had been the warning. A reminder that in this place truth came at a cost. And if you dared to speak it aloud, you wouldn't be sent away. You would disappear. There were 5 of us left who still dared to wonder aloud. Alina and I, of course. Sister Maria, who had always been gentle and watchful, but had grown steadily quieter since Judith vanished. Sister Colette, who hid her fear beneath humor, though her laughter had lost its warmth. And Sister Therese, the youngest of us, just 16 when she entered, still clutching the edges of her childhood while trying to fold herself into silence. We met late at night in the vestry, beneath the veil of shared chores. It was the only place the older sisters rarely visited, the scent of old incense, too strong for comfort. There, between scrubbing brass and folding altar cloths, we began to piece together a quiet rebellion. It started with questions. When did we last hear from home? Had any of us received a letter since our first year? Had anyone been allowed outside the gate since Judith? Maria, with trembling hands, confessed she had stolen a page from the convent's record book. She had worked in the scriptorium that week and noticed something strange. The family ledger listed her as having withdrawn from St. Verena the previous year. It stated she had returned to secular life. Her heart pounded as she spoke, and I could feel mine matching it beat for beat. Colette confirmed something similar. Her family had owned a small shop in the village near the train station. She had seen them once, she said, from behind the iron bars of the chapel's upper window during a winter market. Her mother had walked by carrying bread. She never looked up. She hadn't known her daughter was still inside those walls. We realized then that we weren't just isolated. We had been erased. The records said we were gone. Our families believed we had moved on or gone elsewhere. No one was looking for us. No one was coming. It changed something in all of us. The fear didn't leave, but it hardened, became sharper. We began to prepare, not with the hope of rescue, but with the certainty that rescue would never come. If we were going to survive, we had to be the ones to run. We mapped the halls, watched for patterns. We learned the guard rotations. Only 2 older nuns kept the night vigil, and one often slept in the reading room. We scavenged food, tucking away dried apples and crusts of bread behind loose bricks. Alina kept the cellar key wrapped tightly in cloth and hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible beneath her bed. We agreed to leave during the first major storm. Rain would muffle the sound, cover our tracks. The earth would soften near the rear garden wall, where the stone had already begun to crumble from years of neglect. We didn't speak of what we would do once we escaped. That was too far to imagine. We only knew what we were running from. And we knew the names carved into stone beneath the chapel would never include ours. Not if we made it out, not if we stayed one step ahead of the silence. The storm arrived as if summoned. It rolled in just after vespers, wind howling through the corridors like it had a voice of its own. Rain began to lash the stained glass windows in sheets, and the candles flickered under the strain of the wind slipping through the cracks in the old stone. It was the kind of night that swallowed light and sound, the kind that bent the rules of the world just enough to let someone vanish if they needed to. We had agreed on this moment months earlier, but it didn't feel real until I stood at the back stairwell holding the bundle of food, the torn Bible with the key, and the linen cloak we had dyed to resemble the sisters' night habits. Alina appeared first, followed by Maria, both pale but steady. Colette arrived last, soaked from slipping outside to check the wall's edge. Her voice was low as she reported that the earth had loosened, just as we hoped. It would only take a few minutes to clear enough space to crawl through. We waited in the shadows near the garden, watching the tower above us. No lights. No footsteps. Only the sound of the bell clanging faintly in the wind, as though protesting what we were about to do. Sister Therese never came. We waited until the third toll of the hour. Then we moved. The 5 of us. No words. No prayer. Just movement, breath, and the sound of our hearts in our ears. The garden wall was slick with moss and years of neglect. Colette and Alina began scraping at the loosened edge with the tines of an old rake we had hidden weeks before. Maria kept watch, her cloak pulled tight. I held the small lantern low, shielded from view. The opening was just wide enough when the first flash of lightning lit up the garden like day. For one awful second, we froze. Every angle of our bodies was visible, every fear exposed. Then we heard it, a sound from behind us, the faint scrape of stone on stone, a door being opened, slowly, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. We didn't wait. Alina pushed through first, then Maria. I followed, heart pounding, knees scraping against the cold earth. Colette went next. She turned back once, eyes wide, her mouth moved, but the rain drowned out her words. Then the light hit us again, and she was yanked backward. It wasn't violent, not like in nightmares. It was quiet, sudden. One moment she was crouched beside me, the next she was gone. Just her cloak left behind, caught on a jagged stone, flapping in the wind. We didn't scream. We didn't cry. We ran. Into the field, through the mud, past the last gate. We didn't stop until the storm was behind us and our legs could no longer carry us forward. Colette had fallen behind, and we would never see her again. We never said her name again, not out of disrespect or denial, but because the sound of it hurt too much. Colette had been the one who kept our hope steady, the one who laughed when none of us could, the one who refused to let the fear turn us hollow. And now she was gone, pulled back into the dark like so many before her, leaving nothing but the memory of her hand brushing mine in the mud, and the echo of whatever she had tried to say before she vanished. We didn't stop until sunrise. By then, the storm had passed and the clouds had thinned into a pale gray sky. Alina collapsed first, her legs giving out beneath her. Maria was trembling so badly she couldn't speak. I remember the smell of wet earth and pine and the way the road ahead curved out of sight. We didn't know where we were, only that we weren't behind the convent walls anymore. The town we found was small and unfriendly. No one wanted to help 3 half-starved girls in soaked robes, especially not ones who refused to explain where they had come from. Alina lied and said we had been on pilgrimage and robbed along the road. It was just believable enough to get us a warm place to sit in the back of a church until a priest offered to contact someone on our behalf. That was our mistake. Within hours, 2 men arrived, not in police uniform, but in dark coats with priestly collars. They asked few questions, just our names, where we had come from, why we had run. Maria stayed silent, but I could see the tears forming in her eyes. Alina answered cautiously, giving false details. They nodded, offered to take us to a shelter in the city, promised food, rest, safety. I didn't believe them. I slipped away in the restroom while the others were distracted. I climbed out a window and didn't stop running until my lungs burned. I didn't know where Alina and Maria were taken. I only knew I never saw them again. I don't think they made it far. I think they were taken back, and that the silence that followed was not their choice. I was found days later, delirious from cold and hunger, outside a train station. A woman with a kind face called for help. An ambulance came, then a quiet room with 2 white walls and too many questions. They said I had suffered a breakdown, that I was confused, that no convent by that name was registered in their records. I tried to explain. I told them everything. About the cellar, the names on the wall, the sounds in the night. They listened with polite smiles and recorded my words like symptoms. Eventually, they stopped asking, and I stopped telling. I was 17 when I entered the convent, 22 when I escaped, 22 when the world decided my truth sounded too much like madness. And so, I lived in silence, because silence, at least, could not be taken from me. For years, I lived under another name. I chose Grace because it felt both honest and impossible. I took work as a housekeeper in a parish home 2 towns away from where I had escaped, staying close enough to keep watch, far enough to remain invisible. The priest there was young and uninterested in anything beyond his duties. He let me scrub floors and prepare meals without asking questions. That suited me just fine. I never wore a habit again. I kept my hair short, wore plain clothes, and spoke little. I said I had no family. That was mostly true by then. My parents died in a fire the year after I fled. I don't know if they ever knew what happened to me. I don't know if they would have believed it. In the quiet moments, while washing dishes or folding altar cloths, I thought about the others. Alina's sharp eyes, Maria's trembling hands, Colette's voice calling us to laughter even in the worst moments. I thought of Judith, too, of the line she left behind, scrawled in desperation. They won't let us go. The truth of that sentence haunted me more than any nightmare. Faith didn't leave me all at once. It peeled away in pieces like old wallpaper. At first, I tried to keep it. I prayed silently, alone. I told myself there had been a purpose, a lesson, a reason, that maybe we had survived for something greater. But over time, the words felt empty. I could not speak them without remembering the cellar, the cells, the names carved in stone. God never came to St. Verena's. That much I know. If he did, he looked away. I heard rumors over the years. Whispers of convents closed without explanation, girls who entered and never returned, priests who were reassigned after shadowed complaints. But nothing tied directly to what I had seen, nothing that could be proven. I kept newspaper clippings in a box beneath my bed, collecting patterns, watching for names I might recognize. None ever appeared. I became good at vanishing. I moved houses every few years, left no address behind. I didn't keep photographs. I never told anyone my story. The people I worked for called me quiet, respectful, a little odd. They didn't know I woke some nights with the sound of that bell still ringing in my ears, or that I sometimes pressed my hand to the wall just to feel the solid proof that I wasn't trapped behind stone. For nearly 3 decades, I said nothing. I survived. That was the promise I made. Not to forgive, not to forget, but simply to keep breathing, to outlive the ones who tried to silence me. And yet, silence has a weight all its own. It settles in your bones, in your breath, until it becomes something else entirely. Something colder than truth. I thought I had escaped. But what I really did was carry it with me, every step, every year, waiting for the day it would surface again, and it did, just not the way I expected. Here is Chapter 10 of The Storm We Never Spoke Of, continuing with natural narrative flow and faithful emotional depth at approximately 500 words. Chapter 10, The Letter. It came on a morning like any other. A thin envelope slipped beneath the door of the rectory where I had been living for nearly a year. The parish was quiet, tucked along the edge of a small coastal town where no one asked questions and everyone kept to themselves. I had grown used to the sound of paper sliding across stone, usually bills or notes from Father Brennan. But this envelope was different. No return address, no postage stamp, just my name, written in a hand I did not recognize. I sat with it in my lap for several minutes before opening it. My hands trembled before I even saw what was inside, as if my body knew before my mind caught up. Inside there was no letter, only a photograph, and 6 words written on a plain piece of paper. You were right. She's still there. The photograph was grainy, taken from a distance, possibly through glass. It showed the side of a building I recognized instantly. The west corridor of St. Verena's, its stone darkened by weather, the windows still narrow and tall. Behind one of them, partially obscured by shadow, stood a woman in a faded habit. Her face was sunken, her eyes hollow, and her hair hung in long strands of white and gray. But I knew who she was. It was Colette. Older, changed, worn down by time, but undeniably her, that crooked line of her jaw, the faint arch in her brow. I had seen that expression too many times in the mirror not to recognize it in someone else. It was her, alive, still there. I could not breathe for a moment. My chest tightened. And for the first time in years, I wept without restraint. Not just for Colette, but for everything we had lost. For what we had tried to escape. For what she had been forced to endure while I had lived free, though haunted. I didn't know who sent the letter. I still don't. It wasn't Alina's handwriting. It didn't match any of the priests I had known. The ink was smudged, as if written in haste or fear. But the message was clear. Someone knew, someone had seen her, and someone wanted me to remember. I kept the photograph hidden, tucked behind the crossbeam of my bed frame. For weeks I told myself it could be a mistake, a coincidence, a cruel joke. But I knew better. Some truths settle into your bones in ways that cannot be undone. That image stayed with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face behind that window. Not pleading, not even surprised, just watching. As if she had been standing there for years, waiting for someone to finally look back. It broke something in me. Not my silence, not yet. But the part of me that still believed forgetting was a kind of mercy. That day, I understood the truth more clearly than I ever had before. Survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the reckoning. I had kept quiet for so long that my voice didn't sound like my own when I finally began to use it again. It was dry at first, brittle, as if the words had been locked in my throat for decades and were unsure of the world they were about to enter. But once I started speaking, the silence cracked open, and I could not stop. The first recording was only 10 minutes long. I sat at the kitchen table, an old cassette player in front of me, its red light glowing in the early morning dark. I pressed record and began with my name. My real name. I said it aloud for the first time since I left the convent. Then I spoke the names of the others, Judith, Alina, Maria, Colette. I described the cellar, the restraints, the ledger of names, the smell of mildew and old fear that never left my skin. I spoke about the chanting, the disappearances, the lies we were told, the letters we never received. I spoke about the blood, about Irene, about the night we ran and the way Colette was pulled into the dark without sound or warning. I told the truth. Every broken, brutal piece of it. It wasn't about justice, not really. I was too old to believe in justice. But I believed in reckoning. I believed in memory. I believed that silence, once broken, had its own kind of power. I sent the tape to a journalist I had followed for years. She wrote about forgotten women, hidden histories, the shadows the church never seemed to fully admit. I included the photograph of Colette and a copy of the note. I didn't expect her to respond, but she did. She called me 2 weeks later, her voice careful and reverent. She had listened, and she believed me. She came to visit me in person, bringing a small recorder and a notebook full of questions. I answered every one. I showed her the convent's location, told her the names of the priests who had come for us, gave her copies of the letters Judith had hidden in her mattress. I even took her to the edge of the woods where we had first stumbled free. The place had changed, but the trees still leaned the same way. The path, though overgrown, still felt like an open wound. She promised to publish it all. Names, dates, testimonies. She said there were others too, from other places, with stories that echoed mine more closely than coincidence should allow. She said my voice gave shape to their silence. That night, after she left, I lit a candle and sat beside the window. I watched the wind move through the trees and wondered if Colette could see it too, wherever she was. I imagined her standing behind the glass of that narrow window, watching the world that had forgotten her slowly start to remember. This time we were not going to be erased. Not again. Not while my voice still had breath. They came with cameras and permission slips, officials with clipped voices and laminated badges, escorted by 2 historians and a single soft-spoken priest. The convent had long since been decommissioned, the grounds transferred quietly to the diocese archives. What remained of St. Verena's stood like a hollow relic, stone walls bowed with time, windows dulled by dust. Nothing had changed, yet everything was smaller than I remembered. Age does that. It shrinks things that once towered over you, but it also makes them easier to face. I was not supposed to be there, not officially. But the journalist insisted, said it was right for me to see what would finally be unearthed. So I stood at the gates once more, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, the rosary dangling from my fingers, a quiet echo of a girl I no longer was. They entered through the main chapel where the altar still bore the faint outline of the velvet cloth. Beneath it, behind the panel we had once unlocked with shaking hands, they found the cellar door. The key I had hidden so long ago was no longer needed. They had tools now, drills and flashlights and gear designed for uncovering things left too long in silence. What they found was not a surprise to me, though the others looked shaken. The cells were still there. The restraints, the ledgers, the names. The crucifix still hung above the cracked table in the far chamber, the same room where Alina and I had stood all those years ago, breathless with horror. They took photographs, samples, notes. One of the historians whispered something about the design being older than the convent itself. Ritualistic, perhaps, or inherited from a much earlier time. The priest said nothing for a long while, then quietly recited a prayer I had not heard since my first week at St. Verena's. There were no bodies, nothing that would lead to charges or tribunals, only what we had already known, only proof of what had been hidden, tucked away beneath vows and silence. The church issued a statement. Regret, sorrow, commitment to transparency. No names. No blame. Just carefully worded grief wrapped in absolution. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was this. The cellar was open. The silence was broken. And my voice, once ignored, had been heard. I returned to the convent one last time, months later, alone. The grounds had been fenced off, the chapel stripped bare. But I stood by the bell tower, hand on the cold iron rope, and remembered the sound that had once set me running through the dark. I did not ring it. Instead, I left the rosary wrapped around the base, its chain mended, its beads worn smooth. A marker, not of faith lost, but of truth reclaimed. Then I turned away, walked back toward the path lined with trees, and let the quiet settle behind me like a door softly closing. No more bells, no more silence. Not for me, not for her, not for any of us ever again.